If creativity is your work, what is your play?
Teaching my cat to sit and high five.
Ah.
But also what is my play? I don't know. I play video games, I play guitar and sing, and I'm hearing impaired. I've got a bad voice. Not that one necessitates the other, but for me it does. How do I play? I don't know. We have these great neighbors in the building who have a daughter who's like 7 or 8. And she's lately been coming to our window and like knocking, and we'll like chase her around and pretend to be monsters. And I was like, oh yeah, right. This is really fun. You can just be, basically being a fool is my play. In any capacity, I'll start doing a bit with my partner, Tyler, who, you know, I'll just start talking in a voice, like, I don't know, just anything to get some fun out. But creativity, we put a lot of pressure on it when we want it to be either work or a release valve. Because there are a ton of ways to play and have fun that are not particularly creative.
Exactly.
And I also don't think that fun and work have to be separate. I think they often are, because, well, most jobs just aren't fun all the time. Some are not fun ever. But I have to say, when I'm editing, say, a poem, and I find a good, satisfying line break, I'm like, oh, look at the double meaning I just created. I'm so satisfied and like so happy. But often when I'm slogging through and I'm in the middle, I'm like, have I made this worse? Is this a write-off? Have I spent these 3 hours for no reason for a poem no one's ever going to see? And then that's just for me. That doesn't even account for sending it out and the subjectivity of publishing and all of these things. You know, you are really shouting into the void all of the time. Yeah. So I guess I suggest flirting with the void. Mm-hmm. Getting comfortable. You know, you ever watch the Looney Tunes cartoons?
Yes, I have done. I have a son who thrived on them.
You know when it's Wile E. Coyote and the sheepdog, and then they clock in, morning Ralph, morning Sam. Get like that with your void. Just you know, struggle, fight all day, but then clock in, clock out. Okay, hello. See you tomorrow. Yeah, I don't know if that resonates, but
it does. I mean, it's basically you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable all the time.
Jerry Seinfeld said something really great about creativity in an interview. He said you have to be comfortable that it's going to hurt.
Yes.
Putting yourself forward, because you're making yourself vulnerable. He was talking, I think, about stand-up comedy and performing and tanking in front of a live audience. Sucks. It's horrible. You're like, oh God, why did I think? It really lets that mean voice in your head that you don't really apply to anyone else but yourself come out.
We're very good at that. We're so mean to ourselves.
We are mean to ourselves. I don't know anyone who's not mean to themselves. And in fact, when someone demonstrates not being super mean to themselves, we kind of pile on them. We're like, how dare you think you're something? It's, you know, when I told one of my mom's work associates when I was 12 that I wanted to be a writer, he was like, no, that's not a real job. What do you want to do for money? Sorry, now my cat is crying to go outside.
Of course.
Like, just the whole world, you know, you're told as a child, you can be anything you want to be. And then you hit like 13, 14, and everyone's like, not that.
Yeah, not really.
That's not realistic. You're not talented. You're not pretty. You're not smart. You're not special. Or it's like, you know, we get into this real scarcity mentality, which, look, I've slogged incredibly hard to get where I am, which is not even really that far. That's true. You have to be willing to put in the work, but so many people fall away because of discouragement, because you know, you get rejected so much, because you don't work on the same timeline as other people, because all of the success stories we have really fetishize the outsider and don't talk about the inside connections people have, you know, what have you, and
fear of failure. It's a huge driver, isn't it?
It really is. And that's, people don't talk about their failures. People talk about, we see their successes, and that's, you probably know this, Mary, but I keep a blog called The Losing Game.
I wanted to get into that because that is fantastic. So tell us how that came to be and why you do it.
So The Losing Game is where I chronicle all of my writing feedback responses, but particularly the rejections, because it feels like you're playing a losing game. It really just does. But a friend of mine in the States, when I was sort of I've been writing since I was 4, and before I could write, I would pretend I knew cursive and pretend I was writing stories. This is just something I've always wanted to do. But, also people come to it later and kick ass. So no worries if that's not you, audience. But when I was starting to be like, when I was in high school, the world was different. Everyone says that, but like we didn't necessarily have the resources being like, okay, you write, now this is how you send out your work. This is how you publish. You publish X amount of pieces to get grants, and this is how you get paid as an artist. You get a break or you don't. This is how you pitch sub-publishing houses. I didn't have that. So when I was finally learning how to do that when I was like 23, I sent out like 4, not even, maybe I sent out 3 things and got them rejected. And I was aiming really high. I didn't know, but I wasn't as immersed in the world. I didn't know these are like big name journals who are of course not going to take someone who is maybe not very refined yet. But then one of my friends in the States, I was very fortunate to be on Vancouver's spoken word slam team for a while. And part of that meant going to the States and performing with tons of cities as spoken word teams. And so I made a lot of writing friends there. And one of these friends, his name is William James, was posting on Facebook his writing rejections. And he was aiming to get 100 a year. And I was like, oh my God, I'm not doing the work. I thought I was doing the work. Pardon?
Non-goal goal.
Yes. Well, I mean, I would argue it is a goal, but we'll get to that. I thought I had been doing the work because I had been writing and submitting more than I ever had been. But I sent out 3 things. I was like, he is submitting more than 100 times a year. I am not, we think we're doing the work until we get a broader picture, we break further in and we're like, oh, that's the work. And that's an ongoing thing. I mean, that's why the more you know about it, it's why the Dunning-Kruger effects exist. The more you know about something, the less you're where you know less. Whereas people who don't know that much about things, they grossly overestimate how much they know about it. And that can be defeating too. And I'm friends with so many writers and so many people who are talented, who are spoken word performers, who didn't submit writing. And I think it's changing now, but that was how you got the grants. Spoken word and slam used to be very underground. Mm. And I mean, even when I was in it, it was starting to break mainstream, but I'm getting a bit off track. I'm sorry. It's such an interwoven narrative to me.
No, it's pertinent because it was sort of underground art for a long time.
And disparaged of. There used to be a big divide between the page literary community and the stage community, and I think that's changing somewhat. Well, I mean, it's still about the page, but more and more people are seeing the value to experiencing writing on different sensory mediums.
Exactly.
Because hearing a poem is so different than reading a poem.
Yes.
And often, when you write for something to be heard, you're writing differently because you can't go back and be like, wait, what was that? So, you think differently about how you write them. But yeah, I'm sorry, this is a different conversation.
I'm fascinated by it because also the audience would have quite possibly a completely different interpretation and feel for the piece, hearing it delivered by the author.
Yeah.
Rather than, I mean, how many times do we read a poem out loud? We don't. And when we do, it can change the entire meaning of the piece.
And there are so many writers who write for the purpose of sonic elements, but that's on the page. That's so, right. you won't pick up on as much of it if you're not reading it. But there are some poems that are experimental with like line breaks and certain visual aspects that are better on the page. You know, it's a whole thing, as every poetry person knows. But when I realized I wasn't doing the work, I was like, I wonder how many people are getting discouraged over this incredibly small number of things and are not doing the work. So I reached out to my friend and I said, hey, do you mind if I do this too? I will, of course, credit you with being the person who introduced it to me. But it's sort of, not because of me, and I don't know if it's because of him. I think it maybe is an existing thing. Huge number of people aim for 100 rejections a year. And when I started submitting things more, well, I got in the practice. It used to be I would labor about how to write a cover letter. How do you do this? And you'd get so scared. Have I picked the exact right poems based on what I think this publication is? And the truth is, it's like, even if you know exactly the style of the journal, if you know all these things, you can still really labor over the order, labor over everything, and get rejected. And then sometimes you can just throw things at a wall and people are like, yeah, I want this. In fact, I had an experience for about 2 years where, say you would be able to submit up to 5 poems. I'd have 4 I felt so good about, and then I'd just throw one in to round out the submission. And that would be the one that got published without fail for like 2 years. I'd be like, that one? But some works mean more to you as a writer than as a reader, which is interesting too. I used to labor over it, and the more I got into the practice, the more I was like, okay, reject me. Do it. Like, I'm hard. Go ahead. The less I can churn out a cover letter in 20 seconds now. Do you know what I mean? And the return on investments is great. And the stigma of rejection. Well, I did a whole presentation on this, but rejection sets off a danger center in your brain. Like, your brain's like, that's danger. From years and years ago, it's an old evolutionary thing. It's like, okay, the group will reject me. I will die alone. No one will hunt or gather, and I will be lost to the elements. That's what's happening in your brain. Yep. So you're really fighting your biology. So I was like, okay, here are all of my rejections. And it quickly became the most popular thing I did on Facebook. And eventually I got kind of wary of Facebook, and I moved it over to my website, and I started doing little posts about them so that you could scroll right to the rejections themselves, or you could be like, okay, this is like, this rejection hurt for this reason, or like, this was an encouraging rejection, or, this magazine lost your thing, and that happens too, and that's okay. But I've had a huge number of people, reach out to me and thank me, which felt really good, because I was like, awesome, this is having the impact I want.
Yeah.
If you can be like, okay, yeah, reject me, and everyone's like, see, you made a way to make the failure not a failure. And I'm like, no, you found a way to be like, great, failure. Like, to accept failure, to be like, what was it? It's Samuel Beckett, I think, fail again, fail better. Yeah, everyone's like, oh, and in that way it's not a failure. And I'm like, I'm not really trying to inoculate myself against failure, because it is a given. It is a given creatively, even if you're not doing it professionally, that you will fall short of your own expectations. Because your taste is always going to exceed your ability, and that's what keeps you moving forward. But people who are perfectionists, a lot of women,
yes,
are so hard on themselves.
Yeah.
And you can be lost in that chasm between your taste and your ability. And I don't want that to happen to people, because it's so good for you to be able to express yourself, and it's fun, and you never know who it's going to connect with. I've made friends because of this, and I actually have a whole community because of this. And I'd never had a community that I had chosen for myself. You're in high school, that's your community based on who's in your school district, based on propinquity. And I had never really been a participator. I was a very cynical high school student who was like, prom, clubs, people who get active, which is like such adolescent bullshit. So self-important. But once I had a community, I was like, oh, this is really valuable and enriching and essential. Yeah, I mean, what are we doing here if we're not connecting with people? Am I right?
Exactly. And really, the power comes from the vulnerability. You cannot be a full, whole person if you don't allow the vulnerability to show and be shared.
And I'll be honest with you, Mary, I'm not an emotionally vulnerable person. And this is a note I get again and again in performance. So I look for other ways to be vulnerable because some of us have like such, I'm not one of these people necessarily, but we have a lot, like our vulnerability is heavy and, you know, we may not be ready to share it or we might crumble because a lot of us have been through really hard things. And so, you know, if you can't be emotionally vulnerable all the way at once, you can find other ways of being vulnerable. One of the things I like to do that is comfortable for me, that is often a gateway to just like opening those gates a bit more, is I like to be intellectually vulnerable.
Mm.
I like to be like, yeah, this is the way I think about things. Here are my neuroses, which I'm comfortable. I know I have them and I'm ready to confront them. So one of my poems I like most and that gets the best response performing is my inner monologue when I was sitting behind a guy who had his chair all the way back on a plane. He just leaned it all the way back from before takeoff for all 10 hours of this flight. And in my mind, I was like losing it. I was like, yeah, what are you doing? Like, you know, the flight attendant was like, sir, can you please put up your chair? And he was like, oh, yeah. Puts it up. She walks away, puts it back down. And I was like, who are you, you fuckhead? And so I was, you know, it's not a pretty part of myself. Like, who cares? This is nothing in the scheme of the world. But I went George Costanza mad. I got so angry and I was like, you know what? I'm comfortable sharing this. I'm comfortable sharing these uglier parts of myself, if not my pain. So you have to bring yourself to it in some way. But I want to encourage people to do that in a way they're ready to do. Because, you know, sometimes you know, like forcing yourself to be too open too soon can feel terrible. And it can really delay the healing process. So I think it's cool to challenge yourself, but I also, you don't have to like tear yourself open for a voyeuristic world.
No.
Do you know what I mean?
Baby steps, baby steps.
Yeah, little toddles.
But in that vein, if you take the small step, you get the momentum of gaining courage, and from courage comes confidence. So it's an important road to travel. But as you say, you don't have to go to the destination right away.
And momentum is an interesting word too, because that is, you know, like I said, I used to be very disciplined and I wasn't even thinking about it. I was sitting down and writing all the time because I was in the practice of it. And going back to Jerry Seinfeld, who I don't usually talk about this much, but his thing is you write every day and you just X off every box on the calendar. And, you know, we don't all have lifestyles and the privilege to be able to do that, but momentum is so much easier to maintain than starting. Again, going back to the beginning, starting is such a barrier. And then we get into these narratives about being out of practice, we're no good. There are a million ways we try to talk ourselves out of things. And everyone's got their own unique ways of doing it, which is
Now you are at the tail end of your MFA, and I'm curious to know a couple of things. Number one, what prompted you to do that? And also, how has that changed your creative process, or has it?
Yeah, I was prompted to do it out of spite. I had a boss who was really mistreating me. And I said, okay. One day she was like being particularly awful to me. I said, okay, I'm going to apply for my MFA. And a friend and I sat down the night before, banged out some applications, got in, and
that's amazing. So that was a quick turnaround.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'd been writing for years and years before, so I didn't have to come up with a whole portfolio. I had the work.
Right.
It's very different. Like when I applied for my BFA, it was a long, laborious process. But when you have the work, you're like, okay, here you go. And then I wasn't, and yeah, the process has changed me. If only, I mean, I've had some amazing professors and who have taught me a lot more about the revision process. And especially in my fiction, I'm sort of, I'm afraid to get back into things and change things a lot. And that's something I've learned about myself. I'm more of a tweaker, which is not always the way. So I've become more aware of my own habits and other people's habits. And it's been very good for me. And I'm lucky to have gotten to do it. And I made some really lovely friends, and I have some more work that I feel proud of. But, you know, when you spend so much time thinking about writing and practicing writing and surrounding yourself with people who are also thinking about those same things you are and talking about those same things you are, of course you're going to expand yourself. That's where your energy and attention is. So I think I'm a lot better than I was before. You know, it was another one of those things where I thought I was like pretty good before. I was okay. And I think I'm pretty good now, but in like 5 years, I'm going to be like, I was okay if I keep going, if I keep going, which I intend to. I'm in this place right now where I am trying not to talk too much about things I'm working on before they're done, because you can so easily let the energy out.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not. But I feel like, you know, I talk and talk and talk about it. And in my brain, I'm like, okay, I've spent this much time on it. It feels like I've done it. And then I don't do
it. That must explain the zero almost output I have of all the wonderful creative projects I have in my brain. Because I do that all the time. It's done in my head. So why do I actually have to do it in the real world?
Well, and you don't necessarily, because if you're hitting that satisfaction of having solved a creative problem, proverbially, but we also have, you know, different life setups. You're a mom. That takes up a lot more time. I am a cat owner, and that's basically...
The cat owner is pretty, like, the cat's pretty needy. Not the cat owner, but the cat's pretty needy, so...
Oh, I'm pretty needy. I'm pretty needy with that cat. I'm like, oh, my baby, do you love me? And he's like,
not right now.
Please put me down. Yeah. Excuse me, I'm drippy. So, I mean, I'm nervous to talk about projects that aren't done, because I've learned that about myself. And then you feel you're like, well, what am I not saying? Like, it's such a big deal, you know? It's the whole...
I totally get that.